Hey everyone, just a quick reminder. Our new reading group on Pierre Klossowski's Nietzsche in the Vicious Circle, that is starting on August 18th, is now available to patrons who support us at the $5 level. Dive into Nietzsche's philosophy with us as we explore this fascinating text. And as August is already underway, so is our summer reading group on Michel Foucault's The Order of Things. There is still time to join. Also, in September, once we finish Deleuze and Guattari's What is Philosophy reading group, we will turn our attention to Gilles Deleuze's Kant's Critical Philosophy, focusing on the connections between Kant and Deleuze and offering fresh perspectives on Kant's and Deleuze's ideas. All paid subscribers will have access to our Deleuze and Guattari, and Foucault reading group. But if you want to join the Klossowski reading group, head on over to Patreon now and subscribe at the $5 level. Right now, we have Stuart Kendall back on the show to talk about the work of Antonin Artaud and his journey to Mexico. Welcome to Acid Horizon, the Theory Podcast. Today, Will, returning guest Stuart Kendall, and myself, Craig, will discuss the fascinating journey of Antonin Artaud to Mexico, exploring his experiences and their impact on his work. Our special guest here, as I said, is Stuart Kendall, a distinguished translator known for bringing many of George Bataille's works to the English-speaking world. Stuart has previously joined us on Acid Horizon, sharing his profound insights into Bataille's ideas. One of Stuart's latest projects involves a new book on Artaud's journey to Mexico, published by Contra Mundum Press. And I must say, this is a very attractive volume, and it has a beautiful font inside. And we'll get into that a little bit later.
It's a really sexy book, physically.
A very sexy book.
Like if you like those semiotext vibes, this is like a remix on that. It's like semiotext's cooler older brother.
Well, anyway, back to my intro. This book sheds light on Artaud's exploration of indigenous cultures and his quest for spiritual and artistic transformation. Antonin Artaud, a germinal figure in avant-garde theater and literature, is known for his radical ideas and the concept of the theater of cruelty. His journey to Mexico was a pivotal moment in his spiritual and political life. His ambitions in Mexico may be indicative of a particular milieu's broader reaction to the excesses of what I would call Western Prometheism, which includes not only the West's widespread colonial exploits, but also the unfulfilled promises of revolutionary projects in the 20th century. Stuart, we're very happy to have you back on the show.
Well, I'm very happy to be here and happy to be back on the show.
Yeah, great. And I was very excited when you reached out to us this time and told us about this particular volume of letters and lectures that is being published for the first time by Contra Mundum Press. And perhaps you could just talk about the book itself, how it came together. Why haven't these lectures and letters been published previously? And maybe say a little bit more about the project.
Okay, great. I will. It has obviously been published previously in French and also in Spanish. And there's a German translation, I believe, of most of this material. However, the overall editorial schema is original in English. You can't find all of this material in this order, in this way, with this apparatus in any language. So this is a one-stop shop for people that, even if you can read French, you can get everything here in a way that you can't get it anywhere else. And I think that's one of the exciting things about this particular collection. And I mean, I say it's exciting because I edited it. It's translated by Rainer Hanscha as a collaborative project. But I've had this book in mind for a long time, maybe 25 years or so. So Artaud, as you mentioned, and we'll get into his life story a little bit later, perhaps, but he's a seminal figure, but the dissemination of his texts has been problematic, to say the least. So on the one hand, he's one of those guys that everybody has maybe heard the name, or maybe they've read one book by him, often The Theater and Its Double, his collection of theater manifestos. Or maybe they've just read about him in essays by Derrida, Deleuze, and Guattari, or Julia Kristeva, for example. Or even maybe just seen movies that he's been in, because he's a famous actor as well. But his bringing the text over into English, and even, in fact, bringing them over into French in the case of these writings, it's had let's say a choppy and problematic history. I'm not sure how much of the detail I want to drop right away on this, but yeah, where do I want to start with that story? Artaud went to Mexico in 1936. And as you were saying, he was reacting to political events in Europe at that time, as well as things in his personal life and his professional life. And while he was in Mexico, he supported himself by writing. So he wrote a series of newspaper articles, and he gave lectures and did other things like this. And he thought of those things as being, a book. And he published them in translation in Mexico, so it's translated into Spanish. And he hoped that they would be published in Mexico, sometime the following year or something like this, or that he would, be able to collect it into French and have it published in France. That, however, was not to be. He left the manuscripts with a friend of his in Mexico City, and the book project more or less evaporated. And it became a kind of a lost chapter in his life and writing. He managed to publish a few of the pieces in journals back in France the following year, 1937. But then after that, he had his mental collapse in September of 1937. He spent the next 9 years in mental institutions. So the moment in Mexico was there, more or less right up against that mental collapse. And this material, this moment in his career, this kind of pivotal turning point, and there's a lot more to say about that, obviously, the material from it, the writing, more or less vanished. So Artaud, at the end of his career, after he got out of Juarez, continued to write about his experiences in Mexico and to publish pieces related to it. And it's there in many of his later, longer poems and pieces, the radio play, To Have Done with the Judgment of God, for example. So it's there on the fringes. These experiences are there on the fringes of his other works, but there's not a place where all of that came together for him. So fast forward, a generation later, Artaud dies in 1948. A generation later, some scholars in Mexico said, hey, what about those Artaud pieces? And they went and found them, through research. And people are still digging for, lost writings by Artaud, either in Mexico, in Cuba, or Argentina. There's a fabled piece that may have been published in Argentina. Those materials were gathered in 1962, published in Spanish in Mexico. They were then translated back into French for inclusion into Artaud's Œuvre complète. So they appeared in 1971, which is very interesting in terms of the reception of this moment. A major figure, a major moment in his work, very interesting materials, but they take a whole generation to return to kind of publication. Now, switching over into the Anglophone reception of Artaud, Artaud had a massive impact on the arts in the English-speaking world. His theater and its double had a big impact on John Cage and David Tudor, the folks at Black Mountain College, and that's where the translation of the theater and its double by Mary Carolyn Richards, it came out of that, published by Grove Press in 1958. The next major body of work to be translated was the Artaud anthology, published by City Lights Press in 1965, gathering a lot of materials that have been translated in the kind of little magazines of the 1950s. Jack Hirschman edited that. Then, of course, there's the Susan Sontag Selected Writings volume from 1976, and related to it, a collection of material that is actually retranslated and reappears here, called in English, in that version, the Peyote Dance. So portions of this appear in there's a section that appears in Theater and Its Double, his scenario for the Conquest of Mexico, that was there. There's portions of it in the Artaud anthology. Again, portions, some of the letters, some of the lectures, some of the pieces on the Tarahumara are in the Selected Writings. Clayton Eshelman's later translations of the Artaud's writings focus mostly on Artaud's poetry, but again, some of that is related to this material, and so some of these pieces appear in both those places. But 25 years ago or so, I was like, why don't we have a one-stop shop where we can read everything related to Artaud's journey to Mexico, and we can see this chapter kind of between covers. We can follow the whole arc of it, which, as I said, is something you can't even do in French. The collection of writings from Mexico called Revolutionary Messages appears in one volume of his Œuvre Complète, and you can get it in a kind of slim paperback also. And then the writings related to the Tarahumara are in another slim paperback volume and another volume of his Œuvre Complète. So even in French, there's not a place where you can see the whole story. And that gives us a very skewed picture of the journey itself and everything that motivated it. It's kind of beginning, middle, and end. Then, of course, there's this other layer, which is the letters, which you've mentioned. Artaud was a great letter writer. It might have been his preferred form. Many of his essays grew out of letters. He loved to speak to someone, tell them the story. And so what this volume does is it includes all the essays, all the articles, the things from the newspaper, but also the lectures. And it includes those letters that he wrote before he went, that he wrote from Mexico, and that he wrote later as he was reflecting on the publication and what would happen with these texts. And what we see in those letters is kind of his life story, the story that lent him there, or that brought him there, the things that he underwent while he was there. It's that extra layer. It's an ironic layer in Artaud's case because Artaud is one of the great theorists of, let's say, the dismantlement of subjectivity. He's someone who his work is about events, it's about forces and energies, but he's not interested in the limitations of individual identities. Rather, he wants to shatter those and figure out how community and political organizations can be remade. How can culture be changed? Rather than focusing on individuals, in a sort of narrow sense, though the individual is very important to him, and this is a fine point that we want to come back to. That's not his main interest. So it's deeply ironic then that Artaud's life story should overwhelm and take over the interest of his, let's say, contribution, his thought. His thought transcends the individual, but his life is so dramatic and compelling that we often can't help ourselves but start telling stories about it, which I'm sure that we're going to do more in a few minutes.
Yeah, and I see the potential for a community to grow out of the possibility of recovering those letters from Cuba and Argentina and those places. So maybe listeners, if you're in those spaces or planning to go there, adventure awaits. And I think in order for us to get a better sense of the forces that motivated Artaud to take this journey to Mexico, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the precursors, which is his relationship with the Surrealist movement and also his relationship to the existing Marxism of the time, because what we see is not only internal tensions within the Surrealist movement, but also a failure of the revolutionary aspirations of Marxism and Surrealism to kind of brook an alliance of sorts. And it looks like in the end, based on the lectures that he gave in Mexico, that Artaud believes Surrealism to have become passé in some sense and devoid of this revolutionary spirit. So maybe you could give us the sort of prequel to this.
Yeah, I'll take a step even back further and just say some things about Artaud's life and kind of who he was, despite the irony of doing so, to kind of set us up for an understanding of how he ran alongside those movements and forces. And that will lead us into that discussion, which is, I think, an absolutely crucial one for really, not to overstate it too much, but for our times and why I'm so excited to be talking about this. Nonetheless, who are we talking about? Antonin Artaud. He's a guy who was born in 1896 and died in 1948. He's born in Marseille, and so he's part of this kind of Mediterranean culture. His family had come from, the Eastern Mediterranean, Syria. So he's, kind of multilingual, in terms of his upbringing and orientation. But he was also a somewhat sickly child. He had meningitis when he was 5. He most likely had congenital syphilis from his father. And so that contributed to his health problems later on. Needless to say, by the time that he was an adolescent, he had been diagnosed with what they were calling at the time neurasthenia, which is effectively a complex of anxiety disorders with fatigue and nervousness, headaches, this kind of thing. And he spent 5 years or so in and out of hospitals, rest homes, and things like this to try and get over that anxiety. These were the years of World War I as well. So there was a lot to be anxious about. It's somewhat understandable. And he was an artistic temperament. He was already writing poetry and drawing at that time. But unfortunately, also in 1919, as part of one of these cures in a clinical setting, he was given laudanum to help him, as a palliative. And that began a lifetime of opiate addiction for him. So he struggled with, let's just say he had a paradoxical relationship with opium. On the one hand, he railed against any laws that made opium or any drugs really, illegal. On the other hand, he suffered his addiction profoundly and desperately wanted to be rid of it. So he wanted access to drugs when he wanted them, but he also wanted to have control of it. And he did not. So his life has this kind of cyclical, kind of thing that he's running through where he is very successful for a certain period, and then his drug addiction gets out of control. And it has a shattering impact on him and exacerbates the other problems that he has and destroys his relationships and creates tremendous financial difficulty throughout his life. Nevertheless, in the 1920s, he finds himself, within the artistic milieu of the high modernism in Paris. He moves there to become active in the theater, and becomes very successful as an actor. He works with some of the best, kind of most impactful theater companies in Paris in the 1920s. First as a sort of bit player, but then moving into larger and larger roles and taking more and more control of what he's doing and then writing about the theater. He also becomes a film actor, and he's in two of the greatest films ever made, Abel Gance's Napoleon and Carl Theodor Dreyer's The Passion of Joan of Arc. So, some people know Artaud just from that because he's such a galvanizing figure within the silent cinema. And then, transitioning into the early years of sound cinema. But at that same time, as you mentioned, he is writing poetry and criticism and other things, and he becomes friends and joins into the Surrealist group in its peak early moment, 1924 to 1926. He's a key player in the Surrealist movement at that time. And crucially for our discussion here today, his closest friends within the Surrealist group are people like Michel Leiris and André Masson. So if we're going to think of Artaud as a Surrealist, we should think of him as part of that offshoot group, what's called the Rue Blomet Surrealists, that are frequenters of André Masson's studio there. So they're not the Surrealist idealists that are associated with André Breton, who do believe in dreams and, the liberation of the unconscious and this kind of stuff, but tend towards that much more idealistic tendency. Artaud is friends with Masson, let's call them the dark Surrealists. So other people are there too, it's Miro, but it's also Georges Bataille. So Artaud, Bataille, Leiris, André Masson, we can associate them and their interests quite closely together in that 1920s moment. And, we can say a little bit more about this as we go on. Nevertheless, Artaud and André Breton and that group run into trouble in 1926. Artaud has been increasingly successful in theater and film. And for André Breton, that sort of commercial activity is to be frowned upon. At that moment, also, Breton and the other sort of mainstream Place Blanche Surrealists are flirting with Marxism. So they want to join the Communist Party. And Artaud doesn't think that is the way forward, either for Surrealism or for revolution. So at that moment, Artaud is expelled from the Surrealist group. He would say that he left of his own accord, but, that's the way these stories go. The main point of it is that they disagreed over the nature and sort of scope of revolution. For Artaud, and he writes about this, he says, what does it matter who has control over the means of production? Whether it's the bourgeoisie or the proletariat. For Artaud, this doesn't matter. He says, in the eyes of the absolute. What matters for him is healing individual pain. Change the heart and mind, change the body of society and you change society. So that's what Artaud, even in 1926, was already interested in doing. Now, trying to figure out how to do that, what's the right vehicle for that, that would take him some more time. But that's ultimately where he ends up in this Mexico project. Needless to say, he gets expelled from the Surrealist group. They move on. Of course, they join the Communist Party and utterly fail in that endeavor, we should remember, right? Breton joins the Communist Party, but is not so interested in taking orders from anyone, doing the grunt work of, party-based revolution. This is
so it goes.
Yeah. That's not for Andre Breton. So they very quickly scale back their interest. And that's, that's deeply ironic also in terms of the fact that he just had this fight with Artaud. They published about it. They were like, no, you need to join. No, you need to. It was a big mistake. Artaud, though, deepens his interest in the theater, founds his own theater company, which ultimately fails, and then has a galvanizing experience in 1931 when he attends the performance of a Balinese theater group that's performing at the Colonial Exhibition in Paris. And so this blows Artaud's mind. The idea that there is something out there. And, he had already been reading a little bit in this area, but it utterly galvanized him and changed the way that he thought about the potential for artworks of all kinds. The Balinese theater is not Western or European psychological theater. It's a theater of dance, pantomime, and gesture. It's not a theater of words. It's a theater of the body. And so this changes Artaud's direction, or rather deepens it. These are things that he already believed and was interested in, but he finds this other space to project that sort of research and energy. And it launches him, that show launches him onto an investigation of, ways to get outside of the Western box. And he's also interested in other ways to get outside of the Western box. He's reading Asian and South Asian philosophy and religious texts. He's interested in alternate forms of medicine, getting beyond, let's say, Western medicine, the limits of Western medicine. So he becomes interested in acupuncture and, Chinese medicine more broadly, this kind of thing. And so again, with that, you got to remember, addict, body in pain, traumatic consciousness, the erosion of consciousness is a profound experience for him. His feeling that words have lost their meaning. Those are all things that are gathered together for Artaud. And for a few years in the early 1930s, he's using theater as a way to, hopefully heal that body, to become the space where all those energies can be gathered and move forward. And he writes essays, manifestos on this theater for about 5 or 6 years, really culminating around 1935, at which point he also stages his, let's say, most independent theater production. He'd already staged a few things in the 1920s with his theater group, the Alfred Jarry Theater. But this play that he did in 1935 called The Sancy, which he wrote, is the thing that he owns the most. And unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, it fails after 17 performances. And it's 1935. So politics are changing dynamic in 1935. And Artaud gives up on his artistic endeavors at that moment, and he pivots utterly. And he does so, and I'll tell just a brief thing here, and I'll let you get back in. He does so in response to this meeting of, it's called the International Congress of Writers for the Defense of Culture. And it's organized by left intellectuals, including René Crevel, André Malraux, Ilya Ehrenberg, these people that are left-leaning intellectuals, and they're interested in doing something to combat the rise of fascism. So they organized this Congress in June of 1935. They invite Artaud to speak, but he does not. He writes a letter, which is in the book, saying why he can't go. And the reason why he can't go is because he thinks that Western culture should not be saved. It should not be defended. That what we need to do is transcend this culture, which he says has only intended to tyrannize over life. We need to invent a new kind of culture. And so that's a profound shift. And it's an interesting moment, right? That's the moment, 1935, when André Breton and Bataille collaborated briefly in counterattack. They're trying to harness the power of myth and religion as a way to combat the rise of fascism. So there's a lot more to say about that. But it's that same moment that Artaud is responding to when he says, I need to get a boat ticket to Mexico, because I think that in Mexico, I can find a way to forge that new culture, or at least awaken it. I can find the tools there. There's more to say.
One thing that I really like both about the introduction and the selection of texts is just there's an emphasis here in both the letters, the essay on the anarchy of art and the essay on escaping European civilization, that emphasizes a political moment, an instance. And I really like that you brought up Artaud's role in Abel Gance's Napoleon, because I've always felt like the death of Marat is like, you've got the one version by Jacques-Louis David, right? Which is this extraordinarily neoclassical, beautiful depiction of a man almost sleeping. And then you've got this horrific, hideous death that Artaud is kind of depicting, where there's blood spilling from the rusted iron tube that is Marat's tub. And there's this moment where Artaud says in the Social Anarchy of Art, where epochs have an unconscious just like people do. And he writes that the dark parts of that shadow are precisely what have to be sort of extinguished, but at the same time sort of given a kind of voice to. And that comment is then followed by an assault on the reigning conception of materialism. Like, this is a deeply philosophical, like, even though it's just a few pages, a deeply philosophical argument here that materialism in his time had turned into a kind of malign spiritualism.
Yeah.
And I think that there's something about the way in which Artaud is trying to bridge art and politics through specifically two things: toil and anxiety. And I feel like that's why his depiction of Marat, where he's staring up, with his arm dangling, rather than, its depiction where he's not done writing yet, right? The corpse is lying beautifully, almost angelically, like the French Revolution is not done being written, and so on. And for Gans, like, no, he's very dead. And so there's this moment in this essay too, where he speaks of Chenier as the primary proponent of guillotine, as being someone who becomes a useless reactionary who's able to just disappear into history, and without pity or poetry. And I love that we're able to see this sort of linkage of the intensity of the moment and the shifting landscape of art. And what I love about your introduction is the conflict with Breton is kind of a perfect, I don't know the precise word for it, but the perfect kind of ancillary for what's going on here. And I'm wondering if, when you were putting these together, given the vast, like everything from experimental anthropology to kind of fidgeting almost with magic that would be absolutely sort of foreign to him in the most clear sense of the term, how difficult was it to try to, because Artaud is all over the place, right? And yet for some reason at the end of your journey with him, you find you're able to come to some sort of clear, concise political attestation. All right, or at least at the very least, that's what the thinkers that our generation tends to romanticize, like Deleuze, Foucault, and so on. They have, like, the theater of cruelty was a really important moment for them, and I'm wondering if pulling this together, is there not a sort of given the very specific political situation that the West faces today, if there's not sort of a need to return to these figures who, in a kind of not even gestalt way, but chaotic way, we're pulling together all of these various disciplines and conflicts and various filths. Can Artaud's form of life be a sort of guide for how we can sort of set an epistemic frame for this moment?
Well, so there's a lot in there to tease out, and there's not a chance that I will be able to pick up all of the threads that you just or all the crumbs that you just laid out there through the forest. One thing I want to say about this book, or maybe one thing I'll say as a starter to responding to that is yeah, I mean, it's an extremely diverse and complicated bag of bolts. It's got, just in terms of the genres that we see represented here, we have letters and we have lectures and we have articles written for the newspaper that are, 2 or 3 pages, 4 pages long. So they're written for a kind of a mass audience to a certain extent. And then we have other pieces that are going to appear in the kind of high literary press in France. And then there are, poems too. So there's a lot of material here that's related to these same experiences and political things. There are essays on aesthetics, and like there's a short piece on Franz Hals. There's articles about Mexican painting. So it's a really wide range of materials that Artaud touches upon. And we should say, some of those articles were written at the request of editors in Mexico. Like they said, hey, you're writing stuff. You are here as, and this is another irony, the editors in Mexico, the intellectuals in Mexico and artists, they said, you represent surrealism. You represent the latest trends in European culture. And yet Artaud went to Mexico to transcend European culture. So he became a representative of the very thing that he detested most of all. So that is, how do we escape ourselves? This is a book about the stranger comes to town. But it's also a man on a journey.
In a certain sense, though, your point about he's the biggest enemy of conventional unified subjectivity is perfect, because what does Hegel write about the epoch? That we all come to represent it, right?
Yeah.
And you've got these editors who are like, "Oh, you're the man of surrealism," and he's like, "No." So there, in a certain sense, there is already that activity of refusal, right? To refuse to be a totem for a moment, or a sort of a broader representation for a movement, and in that sense, leaving only in place the sort of anarchic anxieties and the extinguishing of that darker shadow.
Yeah, it's an extremely complicated, pile of texts for this reason. And another thing I'd like to say about this is that it's just a grand failure. Susan Sontag famously described Artaud's entire life and project as a failure. And I think that is more or less obviously the case, not only because of his premature death, but also because so many of his projects were botched and just not what he hoped that they, or dreamed they could be. Artaud is, if anything, a collection of fantastic dreams and nightmares. What he intends to find, but what he gets to do, does not cohere. It doesn't come together. And then also what we kind of want him to be is not quite there. And that's another thing to say that is a challenge of this book. So some readers are going to come to this book expecting, to find the guy that inspired Deleuze and Guattari. And he's there for sure. But Artaud is doing different things that are not that. And he has more complicated undercurrents, very different and disturbing undercurrents that we can unpack, but that are not what we expect. For the members of the Beat generation, let's say the readers of the City Lights Artaud anthology, that anthology foregrounds Artaud as a man of madness and of addiction, who, that anthology puts his journey to the land of the Tarahumara, this dance, alongside his opium addiction and his problems with opium, but also his attempt to get opium laws repealed. And those are two very different things, right? Like opium and peyote are not at all the same types of drugs. They don't do the same things to the body. They don't function in the same way in society. And yet, people who are mere enthusiasts are going to conflate them. So what we're talking about here is a book that is a failure. It's not a book that Artaud published. It's not a book that even his French editors published. It's not the book that we think it is. And Artaud's journey is not the thing that we think it is. But what that does for us, and here I'm thinking as a historian, an intellectual historian, is it gives us, I think, a great collection of questions that we can ask and use to reflect upon our own political moment. Artaud is asking crucial questions about the nature of community, about our relationship to, here I mean community, culture, civilization. What is it? What should it be? How should it work? How is it related to the individual, to the group? How is it related to the body? How is the body of the individual related to the earth? This is an ecological vision that he is in pursuit of. And he thinks, however mistakenly, but he believes that culture in Mexico, and by this I mean indigenous cultures, is a kind of culture that is in connection to the earth in a way that European civilization is not. He left Europe to find that way to connect to the earth and the sky. It's a solar economy that he's interested in. So it's this ecological vision, but it's also this embracing. It's a multicultural vision. It's interested in the indigenous, and in a way that is, we can say deeply problematic and disturbing to the contemporary reader. Could someone write this book today? One of the things that interests me about this is, like I said, I've been, kicking around these texts and this reading for like 25 years. And Artaud only recently, in the past 5 or 6 years, entered the public domain, which means that we can publish more translations of his works. There's a very problematic history of, the dissemination of his texts, and I've said a little bit about that. But now we can have a new kind of access to it because of the expiration of copyright. And that allows us to have this little workshop in his life and work in this book that lets us revisit questions of culture, ecology, and indigenous life that are very timely questions, I believe, today. With whether we're talking about the therapeutic use of psychedelic drugs, which is a new topic that again, we can only talk about right now, that could not have happened 40 years ago, as well as our relationship to indigenous cultures, non-Western cultures. And even using the word Western here is not my favorite, let's say, phrase. I like to think of the global North, not as the thing I like, but rather as the great enemy. Artaud is taking us on a journey beyond the global North. But who has the right to make that journey? How do we establish ourselves as having the credentials to make that journey? And what disciplines of inquiry are going to help us, to aid us in that journey? And then finally, what's going to happen to us when we get there, which is another really important point. And there's stuff to circle back on in all of this. But one of the deep ironies is that Artaud went to Mexico trying to transcend European civilization. And what he found was a group of artists and intellectuals who wanted to become European. The Mexican artists and intellectuals wanted to become Marxists. They wanted European intellectual, say, property, influence. And they wanted Artaud to tell them how to do it. So how does that type of influence work? What are we bringing? What stories do people want to hear when we start speaking? I'm haunted by Nietzsche's phrase from Zarathustra that mine is not the voice for your ears. How do we hear someone else? What should we be telling them? So all of that is a set of problems in this book that are not satisfyingly resolved. As I said, Artaud went to Mexico, and it's fair to say that we can see part of his journey towards his psychotic breakdown in these texts. He goes into the land of the Tarahumara to look for a land of meaning, to find, to find a connection to the earth. But in that search for connectivity, his mind begins to collapse. He falls into a labyrinth of signs. He finds meaning everywhere. And that is paranoid delirium, not culture. So, it's all in here in a very problematic way. But I'll pause again.
I'm glad we built this discussion up basically from the bottom up biographically, because I think there's what I would call a meta-biographical aspect to understanding Artaud, because upon reading this for the first time, I guess I suffered from a kind of reaction to some of the claims that were made, which I addressed to you in my questions, which were, basically he's inverting fascism. He's looking for a blood and soil in this indigenous place. And given our enlightened times with respect to like decolonial theory and so forth. And as you said, all of this just wouldn't pass muster today in academia at all. But understanding where he comes from and understanding perhaps the very timely not only dislocation, alienation, and disorientation that comes from the exploitation of the global South by the global North, it seems plausible that this would be a sort of incipient reaction from anyone who seeks to understand or, break through to the other side to see what it's like, whether it's a kind of Orientalism or Mexican tropicalism in the case of, in Artaud's case. It seems that he wants to make the spiritual connection that then bridges the divide, which then I guess brings us to this question of fascism ultimately, because there's a bit of Artaud apocrypha that I'd like to have cleared up here. I mean, clearly fascism was a target of Artaud, and I think this is written somewhere in Artaud's work. He talks about the emotional fascism of the theater and the way in which the theater of cruelty breaks us out of the practices that keep the actors trapped, that keep the creators trapped within the sort of grid of intelligibility that is Western theater of the time. Yes. But at the same time, there's this statement that Bataille had recorded somewhere where he says that Artaud had said, "Believe me, we need to create a Mexican fascism." And when I saw that, it was a kind of standalone statement. Like, what's Artaud talking about here? Are these the ravings of somebody who's lost in their madness? But then, upon reading deeper into the book, there's a sort of unfolding or explication of that. And I think your biography does more to sort of enhance the reasons we should be probing Artaud's concerns and see how that sort of fits into, I think, this larger process of reconciliation between the global North and the global South. And so with that said, maybe you can respond to some of those comments in the context of, like, why is it that Artaud did go to Mexico?
Yes, there's a great deal to say. Before I go to the Mexico question, let's think about the fascism thing for just a second, and then we can circle back to Mexico. And really what I want to just say here is that, at that same moment, 1936, so it's 1935 with the Congress of Writers for Defense of Culture. That's the same moment as counterattack, Breton and Bataille. People are trying to find a way to harness the resources of fascism. And here I'm literally quoting Bataille. Harness the resources of fascism to fight fascism. And what that means is, how do we excite emotion? How do we harness irrational passions? For Bataille and also for Artaud, the problem with Marxism is that it's too intellectual, that it's a spiritualism, which we had mentioned earlier, and an abstraction. So what both Bataille and Artaud want to do is harness the power of myth, the power of a true materialism, and those kinds of things, so that they can, create a new kind of community, which binds us together in a way that Marxism in 1935 was failing to do. And of course, failed to do ultimately as well. So this phrase Mexican fascism, which Bataille, he holds that out to say, look, this guy's not good. But, it depends on sort of where we're going to put that emphasis. So why Mexico? Let's go back to that. Mexico as a specific thing is almost overdetermined and underdetermined marker in Artaud's work. He first mentions it really in proposing a scenario for his projected theater of cruelty, which he writes in January of 1933. So this is years before going to Mexico, 2 years anyway. But it's this, strangely galvanizing place for him. And it's hard to say exactly what specific thing motivated it. Is it that that he had read this, he was an actor in a radio play by Paul Claudel about Christopher Columbus. And so it's about the discovery of the New World. And that play has a lot to do with colonialism and, Christianity and conquest. And so you can see Artaud wanting to say more, do more, react to that. And his scenario for the conquest of Mexico is about dismantling the legacies of Christianity and colonialism. So it's an anti-colonialist piece at that moment. And colonialism was an active agent at that time because we have, the Italians in Ethiopia and this kind of thing. So fighting colonialism is not merely a kind of abstraction. It's a thing that can be deeply motivating. But there are other people writing about Mexico too at that time. You have D.H. Lawrence, who went to Mexico in the 1920s, wrote his novel The Plumed Serpent about his trip there. Anais Nin, who Artaud had a relationship with, 1933. She wrote a book about D.H. Lawrence. It's easy to imagine them talking about the meaning of Mexico. Lawrence's book, Mornings in Mexico, was translated into French that same moment. So we can see that. But the wider cultural meaning of Mexico in the 1930s has something to do with revolution as well. You have to remember that the Mexican Revolution went through a few different phases, but it had started in 1910 with a kind of violent decade, and then settled into a strongly socially transformative but anti-clerical period in the 1920s, before settling into the 1930s when it was attempting to be transformative in Mexican society. And as part of that gesture of revolution in Mexico, they were not simply, eliminating their cultural heritage. What they were doing was trying to reclaim their cultural heritage. And Artaud really responded to that idea, this notion that a place needs to look at its history and find a way to incorporate that history into its path forward. And so what Artaud wanted to do in going to Mexico, and this is, again, hard to pin down, where are these sources? What did he read that said that people in Mexico wanted to return to Columbian, pre-Cortesian civilization? He believed that's what was happening. He thought that the Mexican Revolution in that phase in the 1930s involved a return to some form of indigenous culture. So it was a step back in time towards another kind of culture entirely. And it's that he wanted to tap into. So it's like utterly wiping modernity away. And of course, there's a lot to say about that. First of all, he's wrong. That's not what was happening. But the fact that Mexican intellectuals and artists, just to take Diego Rivera, for example, Diego Rivera does include in his grand murals references to the Mexican cultural heritage. The Mexican cultural heritage was a thing that they were busy reclaiming at that moment. The relationship to the indigenous cultures and the pre-Cortesian cultures is a thing that became central to the emerging Mexican national identity. And so we can ask that same question about other cultures around the world. We can look at the United States and its treatment of its own, native and indigenous populations. We have not done the same thing, to say the least. Those cultures are not part of our contemporary narrative of self-understanding. And what interests me here is a question that I put under the phrase of learning to be local. How do you become local to a place? What is it to know the place, like someone who really lives there, that has lived there for a long time? And so Artaud was interested in finding something like that in Mexico. But I'm gonna pull out a little bit, because those were not the only forces that were leading him there. Mexico for him is sort of the closest far eastern place. You remember how the Balinese theater was the thing that was deeply motivated to him. And he was interested in, Asian and South Asian philosophy and medicine. Mexico is a lot closer by boat than Bali is. And for a man with no money and financial trouble, it becomes an easier place to reach. So not only does it have the kind of cultural offerings, this notion of a return to the indigenous, but it's easier to reach. So when we read his manifestos on the Oriental theater and the Occidental theater, and I'm using those terms because they're the translations in the theater in Stubble, and it's Mary Carolyn Richards' version. When we read those things, Oriental theater, Occidental theater, we can think about the Orient, the East, and we can think about Artaud going to Mexico as a place that is the East for him. It builds on that idea, that way of getting out of the Western box. So it's very symbolic and kind of mushed together and mistaken. And one thing that interests me about this, again, going back to sort of the failures and mistakes, we go to a place, we travel, whether it's tourism or something else, often for just inaccurate, wrong-headed reasons. We have heard a story about a place, and that story is probably not true. Even if, whatever it might be, we might have been inspired by a movie or a thing that we read. But how many of us go to a place knowing what we will find there? And really, if we did go knowing what we find there, would that be the hero's journey? The hero's journey is to go into the unknown and to be open to it. So Artaud is doing several things in that. I'm going to throw another layer on this that's even more problematic than everything that we've mentioned thus far, and that's saying a lot. And that is Artaud's interest in the occult and the esoteric and hermetic traditions. So some of this is on the surface of the text. He mentions Paracelsus, the alchemist, frequently. His close friend, René Allende, was writing a book on Paracelsus at the time, and Artaud was deeply taken with that alchemical way of thinking about homeopathy and, plant medicine and all kinds of things. So he's on an alchemical and occult journey to Mexico as well. And so this is one reason why, for example, he always refers to it as the red earth. The red earth, as opposed to the white earth or the yellow earth. These are categories that occult writers in France in particular, and the key one for Artaud is a guy named Antoine Fabre-Dolivet. Occult writers use these colors to designate races, but also periods and places. So the red earth is an occult reference rather than a reference to Mexico, sort of purely and simply. And it's not only that. If we're reading more widely in Artaud, the color red is the color of menstrual blood. The red earth is the mother earth. It's the menstrual earth. And the white is not just the white man, it's the patriarchy. It's the man in the sky. So there's a solar male-female exchange that is going on there in an occult reading of the white race and the red earth that is at work in Artaud's text. And that's probably too much for us to unpack much more today, but part of what I'm looking at here is all of the forces that and here I mean discourses, languages, ideas that sent Artaud on this journey. So some of them are unhinged, like these occult readings, and then some of them are merely misguided. Some of them are near truths, like the recuperation of native heritage, and there's a beauty in that recuperation. But how is it to be done? What's to be done? So again, this book is complicated and problematic, and it can tell us about success, by which I mean the kind of culture that we need to survive in the future. And here I'm thinking culture, ecology, and being local, learning to be local. But it's also about being misguided. So, thoughts?
Will, do you want to get in there before I ask my last question?
Yeah, sure. As the one who, for some reason, is labeled the anti-Marxist out of the three of us, I don't know why. There's this moment in his essay and I really appreciated your comment on his going to, I wrote it down, let me see. Artaud went to Mexico to transcend Western civilization, and what he found were artists and intellectuals who wanted to be Western Marxists. Obviously, it's a bit of a folly to try to transcend Western civilization by going to Mexico, right? There's there's already a Eurocentricity placing itself in the sort of eminent otherness of the Mexican culture and so on. But there is this one section of that essay, I Wanted to Escape Western Civilization, where he writes, there is a war between Marxism and myself, and this war rests on a distinct notion of individual consciousness. Marxism claims that it is impossible to reach consciousness precisely because consciousness is something we have no knowledge of. We want to force individuals to behave socially in an equitable manner by forcing them to do so through the determination of facts. There is an attitude of contempt for a human consciousness which I share, and I think with Marxism that every individual is rotten. But there's a key distinction between the way in which Artaud speaks of the word individual and Marxism of his time speaks of the word individual. And I was wondering if you could elucidate on that cleavage a little bit, because I think some of what, because the first part of that passage is anti-Hegelian, right? Like, we have to stop with this whole idea of, the fact of the world and human consciousness intermingling and reaching the actualization of world spirit. Like, that's fascism. But then the second part is really about the social period of his time. And I was wondering if you could talk about the difference between maybe the way the Marxists of his age were talking about this concept of individuality, individualism, the individual as such, and Artaud, and why maybe that could be one of the many guiding threads in the more esoteric parts of this book.
Yeah, it's a complicated business, but also somewhat simple. Artaud would fault Marxism. He faults Marxism for being, in my phrase, it would be insufficiently materialist. For him, Marxism of his day is really interested in, let's say, class consciousness, membership in groups, this kind of thing, but then also sort of rational solutions to political and economic problems. And Artaud himself is trying to get beneath all of that. He wants to get beneath individual consciousness into some kind of, way of participating in the forces and energies, he would say forces of energies of the dynamic universe, by which he means, the world. This is, it's his metaphysics. It's the way that he sees the world. And it also comes out of his reading of Heraclitus. And I think we can take it back to the things that he shares with Georges Bataille and André Masson in the way that they see the world as a space of metamorphosis and dynamic change, but really matter. So when you're reading Artaud, one, key word that he uses is concrete. And so he talks about the notion of the concrete. And the concrete for him is matter. And matter is different than materialism. Materialism is an abstraction that may refer to matter, but matter is actual relationships of force and energy. And what he wants to do is situate himself in the flows of force and energy. In his book, Heliogabalus, or The Crowned Anarchist, which came out in 1934, he talks about the word anarchy. He uses the word anarchy to describe this. And what he says, anarchy is the unity of multiplicity. And that's a phrase that Deleuze and Guattari, for example, are going to pick up on and use. But it's emblematic of what Artaud thinks. Artaud thinks that the world is cruel anarchy. It's this multiplicity of churning forces. And what we are is caught up in those forces. And we can think about it however we want. But the events that are driving us are those things. And so what he wants to do is sweep away all abstract culture. So, dependence on the text, hierarchical organizations of authority, control mechanisms, all those kinds of things. He wants to eliminate the superstructure of that type to return us to matter. This is what Bataille would call base matter. Artaud's anarchy is Bataille's headlessness. And so they're sharing this same interest in trying to derive a mythology for culture and political community that is rooted in matter itself and these flows of energy, rather than in party organization, planning, and rationalism in that sense. So that's where Artaud is. That's where he's trying to go. But it makes for a very slippery read. And again, some of the other terms that he uses that are closely related to these either come out of Bergson. So, for example, he talks about vital forces. He wants to find a vital culture. And that is a Bergsonian notion, something, again, that Deleuze will talk about. But Artaud gets this notion of vitalism, vibrant matter, from that type of thing. Another key word for him is vibration, which is a word that we might, think about today. We have good vibes. But for Artaud, the notion of a vibration is something that he gets out of his reading of the occult tradition. So again, Fabre d'Olivet writes about the musicality of the world, the harmony of the world, the vibrations of music that are in the world. And that's close to these forces and energies. What we need to do is we need to be part of and carried away by the vibrations of the world. So these are occult. They're both philosophical in the Bergsonian reference, but then also occult in this other kind of reference. And then, Heraclitus, too, is part of this kind of anarchy and a war that Artaud perceives to be the nature of nature. But again, the crucial word for him remains cruelty. But cruelty is not just doing harm to others. Cruelty is about he says, the implacability of nature, the fact of fact, that things are what they are, and to be caught in that. So there is tragedy in nature itself. And Artaud recognizes that and accepts that. So that level of, tragic experience, cruel experience, is just part of how he sees the world. He's not looking to cross over into the land of rainbows and unicorns. He's interested in remaking his body and the culture, around it in a way that is in tandem with this matter, this concrete forces and energies of nature. And that to me is like the ultimate dream of this book. It's the dream of his journey to Mexico. He thought that Mexico was a place where he could find that culture. And, he went there for the wrong reasons, but he went there looking for the right thing to a certain extent. And that's what interests me here. How can we learn to be local, learn to be in touch with the matter that surrounds us, learn to live between earth and sun? That's the question of this book.
I think one of the important links that we can make now within the context of this particular discussion is, and maybe this is a slight departure, slight departure from your position, Stuart, is that I think within Artaud's occultism, there is this desire for the reclamation of the imagination that he sees within like the work of Paracelsus in particular. Mm-hmm. And it's within the same breath that he valorizes the alchemy of Paracelsus that he also talks about the ways in which something like Marxism or rationalism, for example, has precluded an ability for him to express the sort of passional distress that he experienced through his illness. And this, I think, if we want to talk, more deeply or end the conversation on what can we get from Artaud politically, this is the one major upshot, I believe, which is, I think Artaud was right to say that something about the Marxism of 1935 was impoverished in terms of its imagination and in terms of its connection with something broader in like the Henri Corbin sense of imagination. And because of that, I think maybe the point where you and I then reconnect, Stuart, is that he is going there for the right reasons. And he's going to Mexico for the right reasons, because part of it has to do with healing the split between what has been separated by the rational from the irrational. I've been doing some just research lately on and we've had an episode too on Georg Lukács and Romanticism, and how at the end of Lukács's life, he seemed to have negotiated a truce with his criticism of Romanticism somewhat, and like the Luddites. And not to mention, just the sort of ongoing rivalry he had with Brecht and Lukács's role in expelling multiple Hungarian academics, one of whom was Karl Karenyi, who was like a mythologist and so forth. I see all of that friction within the tradition, not only of Marxism, but just European academia broadly construed, as being symptomatic of that split in some way. And Artaud appears in Mexico as an avatar, on a journey, on a kind of hero's journey to mend that split. And perhaps the sort of grander vision here is that if we are able to do that somehow, maybe that puts us on a better road to communicating or reclaiming or forging some sort of new identity with what has been lost in indigenous culture, whatever that means.
Absolutely. These are some of the most perplexing phrases in the book, where Artaud is talking about the relationship between the mind and matter. And what he wants to do is to heal the split between the mind and matter. And here, the word mind means spirit, but also mind. And he's talking about things like, what Henri Corbin would call the, creative imagination. It's the way that the mind shapes matter, that we select from it and we find, and our capacity to imagine, to create sign and symbol is the way that we create reality. So Artaud is going to Mexico, and he particularly is going into the mountains of the Tarahumara in search of this capacity to imagine alternate futures and to imagine matter itself, to put himself into, as a mind, but as an imagination, into the world. So he's not in exile from the world. So a reference that's, very close to this is, of course, William Blake, who says exactly the same thing. So Blake's notion of creative imagination is something that, Corbin's going to take up, but somebody like Norman O'Brown also is going to participate in that type of, symbolical consciousness. And that's where Artaud is as well. That's ultimately what Artaud is doing. Artaud's life, in a certain way, is this search for signs and symbols. It's a search to heal the cleavage between words and things. But that's also between, matter, mind, and meaning. And so what he's doing often is he's looking for the right set of symbols. And so theater and its doubles, the very title sort of tells you what he's interested in. He's interested in these doubles. What is that thing that means something? What is the sign that suggests more? And the double then becomes this guide into the world for him. And so painting can be a double of life. Theater can be a double of life. And the journey to Mexico is another thing like that. His book on Heliogabalus, the crowned anarchist, Heliogabalus is another double of Artaud himself. And he's a historical double. But what Artaud wanted to find was a living, real guide into matter and into the life of things. And he thought he would find it among the indigenous peoples of Mexico. So yes, it's about this use of imagination to anchor us in a kind of reality. And, that game, on the one hand is definitely, it's very much a game that is played in, let's just go ahead and call it Western civilization. This split between sign and meaning has a long history and attempting to bridge it. But that's Artaud's ultimate sort of mysticism. That's where he's going. And it is also perhaps the root of his madness, in the end, as he goes into the mountain of signs, as that essay is called, to travel those paths. And he begins to see meaning everywhere, a super saturated world of symbol and meaning. That becomes delirium for him. So finding a way to walk the narrow path where you're not lost in delirium, but you're living in a world of meaning is what Artaud is trying to do.
Well, flash forward to 2024 in the United States in particular. We have an election year coming up, and we are utterly saturated with meaning here today. So the theater of Artaud's mind is now a three-dimensional world within which we live. Despite that, or maybe because of that, what are some ways in which you think Artaud's insights play out positively for us? Or does he act as a cautionary tale in some way? Or what is the real juice here? Like, what does Artaud have to offer for us as we look at this most important election of our lifetimes, or just the general political milieu itself?
Yeah. Well, I do think that this is an extremely timely book because it is about this, first of all, ecology. That Artaud is interested in finding ways to bring the, imagination down to earth, to think about what it means to live in a place. Who lives here? This question about the indigenous, about traveling to other cultures, embracing otherness. These are messages that are undeniable in what Artaud is trying to do. He's also asking these questions about the origin and function of culture. What kind of culture do we want to live in? What kind of stuff do we want to have? The American political debate right now is a debate about a lot of that. Do we want to have electric cars? Do we want to burn fossil fuels forever? What kinds of things do we have? Do we have recycled things, upcycled things, things with futures? How are our objects related to the environment? These are all very large questions of design, but they're things that are playing out, particularly on Fox News. So they're the things that people are talking about. And Artaud is, as you say, there's a cautionary tale here. There's a disaster that happened in his mind. And there are dangers, to overstep the bounds, to take our own presumptions about others and bring them into our our exchanges with them. That's a deep danger that we see Artaud doing. And of course, we see that playing out on the political scene right now. But, at the core of it, at the beginning of it, in 1935, Artaud said, abstract Marxism, class-based, rationalist debate is not going to win. What we need to have is a new mythology. We need to have a new orientation and a new way of imagining political community and culture. And we need that in America today. We have a lot of rational discourse that's not helping us all that much. And then on the other side, we have a lot of fear-mongering and the apocalypse. And people love to hear about the apocalypse. That puts butts in seats. So how can we capture a new myth that can motivate political engagement? That's the thing that Artaud was asking in 1935, and I think that we are asking today.
And overcome some of the cynicism and pessimism that looms large over all of us. Will, do you have any last things to say before we send Stuart back into the theater of cruelty?
No, other than I really appreciate Stuart's work, I think one of the things that is consistent throughout all of your engagements with 20th century philosophy is, and that I appreciate and that I think is gone, is largely just an archaeological endeavor into the wandering of thought that I think has been lost, even in treatments of, again, those big, almost archetypal figures of contemporary philosophical resistance. We're reduced to, we even have hagiographies of Foucault, right? Or, aberrant movements being the depiction of Deleuze, but it's still just standard archiving. But what I really appreciate about books like these is they show us that thought is a movement against the contemporary as we understand the contemporary to be the strictures of our time. So for that reason, I really appreciate this volume.
I do want to I'm going to put a pin in that because I think fantastic. I totally agree. I'm glad you appreciate what I've been doing, but that is what I have been doing. The point is not simply to have, another unfolding of abstract ideas, churning in the bushes of concepts. That's not what I'm interested in doing. We can wander through the history of thought and we can find problems there and also potential solutions. And this is why I love translation and edited volumes. This book doesn't answer all the questions that it poses. It leaves them for other people to do. They can find those answers. They can take it as a cautionary tale or they can find solutions in it, possibly. And that, I think, is the role of the intellectual historian and I think the philosopher today.
And before you go, Stuart, just once again want to say thank you to Rainer Hansche, who sent me Journey to Mexico, Revolutionary Messages, and the Tarahumara. And also, he sent me his own book, which is called Dionysus Speed, which admittedly I haven't read cover to cover yet, but I looked at a few of the pages and it looks quite interesting and very much in the sort of vein of what we're talking about here today. And so thank you once again, Stuart. We welcome you back here today and we welcome you again sometime in the future.
Thank you for having me.